The morning of September 15th started like any other Tuesday in the small mountain town of Riverside Valley. Maya Chen was preparing breakfast in her cozy kitchen, the aroma of fresh coffee filling the air, when the world suddenly began to tremble. At first, it felt like a heavy truck passing by, but within seconds, the gentle vibration transformed into a violent shaking that sent dishes crashing to the floor and pictures tumbling from walls. The earthquake lasted only 90 seconds, but those 90 seconds changed everything. As Maya crouched under her kitchen table, listening to the terrifying symphony of breaking glass and creaking timber, she couldn't have imagined that this moment of terror would become the beginning of the most beautiful display of human kindness she would ever witness. When the shaking finally stopped, an eerie silence settled over the town. Maya emerged from her hiding place to find her home damaged but still standing. Her neighbor's house, however, wasn't so fortunate. The elderly Mr. Peterson's roof had partially collapsed, and she could hear him calling for help from inside. Without hesitation, Maya grabbed her emergency flashlight and rushed next door. She found Mr. Peterson trapped under a fallen beam in his living room, conscious but unable to move. His leg appeared to be injured, and debris blocked the main exit. "Don't worry, Mr. Peterson," Maya said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I'm going to get you out of here." As she began moving debris, she heard voices outside. Other neighbors were emerging from their homes, and soon a small crowd had gathered. Among them was Jake Rodriguez, a construction worker who lived 3 houses down, and Sarah Williams, a nurse from the local clinic. "Maya, step back," Jake called out as he approached with a crowbar he'd retrieved from his truck. "Let me help with the heavy stuff." Sarah immediately began assessing Mr. Peterson's condition. "His pulse is strong, but we need to be careful moving him. That leg might be fractured." What happened next would be repeated countless times throughout the town over the following days. Without any coordination or official instruction, the neighbors formed an impromptu rescue team. Jake and 2 other men carefully lifted the beam while Maya and Sarah guided Mr. Peterson to safety. Mrs. Kim from across the street had already called for emergency services on her cell phone, though the lines were mostly jammed. As they carried Mr. Peterson to safety, Maya noticed something remarkable. Despite the chaos and their own property damage, people were already checking on each other. The Gonzalez family was helping their elderly neighbor, Mrs. Park, clear debris from her front door. The teenagers from the Morrison house were carrying water to anyone who needed it. In the span of just 30 minutes, the community had organically transformed into a network of mutual aid. 3 days after the earthquake, as the town was still recovering from the initial disaster, the weather took a devastating turn. The earthquake had damaged the nearby dam, and when an unexpected heavy rainstorm hit the mountains, the weakened structure couldn't hold. The emergency sirens began wailing at 3 a.m., warning residents of the approaching flood. Maya, who had been staying with Mr. Peterson at the temporary shelter set up in the high school gymnasium, heard the announcement over the emergency radio. All residents in the valley area must evacuate immediately. Flash flooding is expected within the hour. The organized chaos that followed revealed the true depth of human compassion. People who had lost their own homes in the earthquake didn't hesitate to help others evacuate. Jake Rodriguez, whose own house had been red-tagged as unsafe, drove his pickup truck through the dark streets, helping elderly residents and families with young children reach higher ground. Sarah Williams had barely slept since the earthquake, volunteering her medical skills at the shelter. But when the flood warning came, she organized a team to ensure that all the hospital patients and nursing home residents were safely evacuated. She worked alongside Dr. Martinez, who had driven in from the next town specifically to help, despite having his own family to worry about. Maya found herself coordinating with a group of volunteers to manage the evacuation of pets and livestock. She had never considered herself a leader, but crisis has a way of revealing hidden strengths. Working with the local veterinarian, Dr. Amanda Foster, they established a temporary animal shelter in the high school's agricultural building. "We can't leave them behind," Maya insisted as she helped carry a terrified cat to safety. Their family, too. The floodwaters arrived just as predicted, turning the main streets into rushing rivers within hours. From the safety of the elevated school building, Residents watched as their town was transformed into a lake. Houses that had survived the earthquake were now surrounded by murky water. Cars floated down what used to be Maple Street. The damage was heartbreaking, but somehow the community spirit remained unbroken. As news of the double disaster reached the outside world, help began arriving from unexpected places. The first volunteers came from neighboring towns, but soon people were driving from hundreds of miles away to offer assistance. The high school gymnasium became a hub of activity, with cots arranged in organized rows and volunteer stations set up for food distribution, medical care, and coordination of relief efforts. Among the volunteers was Elena Vasquez, a social worker from the state capital who had taken vacation time to come help. She had never been to Riverside Valley before, but she'd seen the news coverage and felt compelled to act. "I kept thinking about how scared I would be if this happened to my community," Elena explained as she helped distribute blankets. "I couldn't just sit at home knowing people were suffering." Elena wasn't alone in this sentiment. Teachers from schools across the state had organized supply drives. Churches of all denominations had sent volunteers and donations. Even a group of college students had driven through the night from their campus 3 states away, their cars packed with non-perishable food and cleaning supplies. The kindness wasn't limited to material help. A team of volunteer counselors had set up a quiet corner of the gymnasium where people could talk through their trauma. Child psychologists had brought games and activities to help the younger evacuees process their experience. A group of local musicians had even organized evening concerts in the shelter, understanding that lifting spirits was just as important as providing physical necessities. Maya watched all of this unfold with wonder. She had lived in Riverside Valley for 15 years, but had kept mostly to herself, exchanging polite pleasantries with neighbors, but never forming deep connections. Now, in the midst of disaster, she found herself part of an extended family that included people she'd never met before the earthquake. One evening, as she sat with Mr. Peterson, who was recovering well thanks to the volunteer medical staff, he shared a thought that would stay with her forever. "You know, Maya," he said, his voice thoughtful, "I've lived in this town for 73 years. I've seen it through economic downturns. I've seen young people leave for better opportunities. I've seen neighbors who barely spoke to each other. But I've never seen anything like this. It took losing everything for us to find out what we really had." As the floodwaters receded after 5 days, the extent of the damage became clear. Nearly 60% of the homes in the valley were uninhabitable. The main bridge had been washed away, and many businesses were completely destroyed. The town's infrastructure would need to be rebuilt from the ground up. But something remarkable had happened during those days in the shelter. The community had become more than just a collection of people who happened to live in the same place. They had become a family, united by shared adversity and mutual care. The recovery efforts were organized not by government agencies or relief organizations, but by the residents themselves, working alongside the volunteers who had stayed to help. Maya found herself appointed to the informal committee that was coordinating housing arrangements. Jake Rodriguez had taken charge of organizing work crews for demolition and cleanup. Sarah Williams was managing medical care for anyone who needed it, working with volunteer doctors and nurses who continued to arrive from other areas. The generosity of strangers continued to amaze everyone. A construction company from 2 states away sent a crew to work for free on rebuilding homes for elderly residents. A group of Amish builders arrived one morning with their tools and materials, asking only where they could help most. They worked tirelessly for 2 weeks, refusing any payment beyond meals and a place to sleep. "It's what we do," explained Samuel, their leader, when Maya thanked him for their service. "When people need help, we help. It's that simple." A children's charity had arranged for a mobile classroom to be set up so that the local kids wouldn't fall behind in their education. College students studying social work used their spring break to provide childcare so parents could focus on cleanup and rebuilding. Even inmates from a minimum security prison were granted permission to participate in the cleanup effort, grateful for the chance to contribute something positive. While the large-scale relief efforts were impressive, It was often the smallest acts of kindness that had the most profound impact on people's spirits. Maya witnessed hundreds of these moments during the weeks that followed the disasters. There was 8-year-old Tommy Chun, no relation to Maya, who had lost all his toys in the flood but spent his days at the shelter making paper airplanes for other children who were crying. When asked why he was giving away his creations instead of keeping them, he simply said, "They need something to smile about." Mrs. Patterson, a widow whose house had been completely destroyed, spent her time in the shelter kitchen, cooking meals for anyone who was hungry. She had been a chef before retiring and found purpose in feeding others, even though she had lost everything herself. "Cooking for people makes me feel useful," she explained to Maya. "I may not have a house anymore, but I still have my skills, and I can still make people happy with a good meal." A group of high school students had organized themselves into a pet care team, walking dogs and caring for cats whose families were too overwhelmed to manage everything. They had also created a lost pet database, helping reunite families with animals that had been separated during the evacuations. The local barber, Mr. Franklin, whose shop had been flooded, set up a makeshift station in the parking lot and offered free haircuts to anyone who wanted them. "A good haircut helps people feel human again," he said. "It's amazing what a little grooming can do for someone's confidence." Even children too young to understand the full scope of what had happened found ways to help. 5-year-old Maria Gonzalez drew pictures for the elderly residents, carefully coloring flowers and rainbows that she distributed like precious gifts. Her grandmother translated her words. She says the pictures are to make the sad people happy again. Dr. Rebecca Stone, a trauma counselor who had volunteered to come help the community, observed something she found professionally fascinating and personally moving. Despite experiencing significant trauma, many of the residents were showing remarkable resilience, and she attributed much of it to the strong support network that had emerged. "I've worked in disaster zones before," Dr. Stone explained to Maya during one of their conversations, "and I've rarely seen a community come together like this. Usually, trauma isolates people, makes them withdraw. But here, it's brought people together in the most beautiful way." Maya had certainly experienced this herself. Before the earthquake, she had struggled with mild depression and social anxiety. She worked from home as a freelance graphic designer and often went days without meaningful human contact. But the crisis had forced her out of her shell, and she discovered not only that she was capable of helping others, but that helping others helped heal her own emotional wounds. The therapy sessions Dr. Stone organized weren't just individual counseling. She had set up group sessions where people could share their experiences and support each other. These sessions often turned into planning meetings for community projects or social gatherings. Healing and rebuilding were happening simultaneously, and they were reinforcing each other. One particularly moving session involved Mr. Peterson sharing his fear that, as an elderly person, he would be a burden on the community during the recovery. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Person after person stood up to tell him how much his wisdom and encouragement had meant to them during the crisis. Jake Rodriguez pointed out that Mr. Peterson's stories about the town's history had helped people feel connected to something larger than the current crisis. "You're not a burden, Mr. Peterson," said Elena, the social worker who had stayed in town to help with long-term recovery planning. "You're part of what makes this community worth rebuilding." As word of Riverside Valley's remarkable response to disaster spread through social media and news reports, it began inspiring similar acts of kindness in other communities. Maya started receiving messages from people around the world who had been moved by the story and wanted to help or share their own experiences of community resilience. A school in Japan, which had experienced its own earthquake several years earlier, organized a fundraiser and sent both money and origami cranes made by students, along with messages of hope written in both Japanese and English. A community in Louisiana that had survived hurricane damage sent a team of volunteers who were experts in flood recovery. They shared practical knowledge about mold prevention and water damage repair, but they also shared something equally valuable: the assurance that recovery was possible. "We were where you were 3 years ago," explained Janet, one of the Louisiana volunteers. "I want you to know that not only will you rebuild, but you'll rebuild better and stronger." and you'll never lose this feeling of connection you've discovered. The story of Riverside Valley's response began appearing in sociology textbooks as an example of how communities can transform tragedy into strength. Researchers came to study what they called the Riverside Valley effect, trying to understand what factors had contributed to such an effective grassroots response. But for the residents, the attention was secondary to the work of rebuilding. 6 months after the disasters, the town looked very different from before. Many of the new buildings incorporated better earthquake and flood resistance. The new community center was larger than the old one and included space for disaster preparedness training. Most importantly, the connections formed during the crisis had become permanent. The experience had changed not just individual lives, but the character of the town itself. New traditions emerged from the crisis that strengthened community bonds and ensured that the spirit of mutual aid would continue. The first anniversary of the earthquake became Community Resilience Day, with activities designed to both remember those they'd helped through the crisis and prepare for any future emergencies. Instead of being a somber commemoration, it became a celebration of human kindness and community strength. The high school gymnasium, which had served as the emergency shelter, was converted into a community resilience center. It housed emergency supplies, served as a meeting place for neighborhood groups, and included a museum exhibit about the disaster and recovery that visiting school groups could learn from. Maya, who had discovered her talent for organization and leadership during the crisis, was hired as the town's first community resilience coordinator. Her job involved not only emergency preparedness, but also maintaining the social connections that had proven so crucial during the disaster. We learned that our greatest resource isn't our buildings or our infrastructure, Maya explained to a group of visitors studying their recovery model. Our greatest resource is each other. My job is to make sure we never forget that. The volunteer network that had formed during the emergency became a permanent feature of the town. Monthly community service projects brought people together to help elderly residents with home maintenance, support struggling families, and maintain public spaces. The connections formed during the crisis were strengthened through ongoing cooperation. 2 years after the disasters, Maya often reflected on how completely her life had changed. She had gone from being a somewhat isolated freelancer to being deeply embedded in her community. She had discovered strengths she never knew she possessed and formed friendships that enriched her life in ways she couldn't have imagined. But perhaps most importantly, she had learned something profound about human nature. In the immediate aftermath of the earthquake and flood, when people had lost their homes, their possessions, and their sense of security, their first instinct hadn't been to hoard what little they had left or to look out only for themselves. Instead, their first instinct had been to help each other. I used to think that kindness was something extra, Maya wrote in her journal one evening. Something nice that people did when they had the luxury of time and resources. But I learned that kindness isn't a luxury. It's what makes us human. When everything else is stripped away, kindness is what remains. The children who had lived through the disaster were growing up with a different understanding of community than previous generations. They had seen firsthand that neighbors could become family, that strangers could become friends, and that in times of crisis, people's fundamental goodness emerged. 10-year-old Maya Chen, who had made paper airplanes for crying children in the shelter, had started a club at school dedicated to random acts of kindness. The members looked for opportunities to help classmates, whether it was sharing lunch with someone who had forgotten theirs or helping a struggling student with homework. Tommy learned something during the flood that many adults never learn, observed his teacher, Ms. Rodriguez, Jake's wife, whom he had met during the recovery efforts. He learned that making other people feel better makes you feel better too. As Maya looked around the town square during the 3rd annual Community Resilience Day celebration, she marveled at how the community had grown and changed. New families had moved to Riverside Valley, drawn by stories of the town's remarkable spirit. The population was actually larger now than it had been before the disasters. But more importantly, the culture of kindness that had emerged during the crisis had become deeply embedded in the community's identity. New residents quickly learned about the town's values, not through lectures or orientations, but through experiencing the same warmth and support that had sustained everyone during the darkest days. Dr. Martinez, who had volunteered during the flood and eventually moved his practice to Riverside Valley, often spoke about the kindness contagion he had observed. Kindness is literally contagious, he would tell medical students who came to study the community's approach to disaster recovery. When people see others acting with compassion and generosity, they're inspired to do the same. It creates an upward spiral of positive behavior. The ripple effects of the Riverside Valley story continued to spread. Other communities facing disasters had reached out for advice on organizing grassroots recovery efforts. Maya had helped develop a toolkit for community resilience that was being used by emergency management agencies across the country. But perhaps the most meaningful impact was on the thousands of individuals who had been touched by the story and inspired to look for opportunities to help others in their own communities. Social media posts tagged with hashtag Riverside Valley Kindness showed people performing acts of service, inspired by what they had learned about the town's response to crisis. 5 years after the earthquake and flood that changed everything, Maya stood in her new home, looking out at the rebuilt town through her kitchen window. Mr. Peterson, now fully recovered and more active in the community than ever, was teaching a group of children how to plant flowers in the memorial garden they had created to honor the spirit of cooperation that had carried them through their darkest days. The memorial wasn't dedicated to the disaster itself, but to the kindness that had emerged from it. The inscription, suggested by 8-year-old Maria Gonzalez, now 13, and serving on the Youth Community Council, read simply, "In crisis, we found each other." Maya's kitchen was often full these days, serving as an informal gathering place for neighbors and friends. The connections formed during those desperate days in the gymnasium had evolved into genuine, lasting relationships. Sarah Williams, who had since become the town's head of public health, stopped by most mornings for coffee. Jake Rodriguez and his wife frequently joined Maya for dinner, often bringing whichever community project they were currently working on. The town had become a model for disaster recovery, but more than that, it had become a model for how communities could thrive when people chose to care for each other. Visitors came regularly to study their approach, but they often left understanding that the secret wasn't in any particular program or policy. The secret was in the fundamental recognition that in helping others, we help ourselves, and that kindness isn't just a nice sentiment. It's a practical strategy for building resilient, thriving communities. As Maya prepared dinner for her friends who would arrive soon, she thought about the letters she had received that morning from a woman in Puerto Rico whose community was recovering from hurricane damage. The woman had read about Riverside Valley and wanted advice on organizing neighborhood support networks. Maya smiled as she composed her response in her mind. She would tell the woman what she had learned from Mr. Peterson, from little Maya Chen, from all the volunteers who had given so much of themselves, that in our darkest moments, we discover our brightest possibilities. That crisis doesn't reveal who we really are. It reveals who we can choose to become. And that choosing kindness, especially when it's difficult, is always the right choice. The earthquake and flood had taken much from Riverside Valley, but they had also given the community something invaluable, the knowledge that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, with open hearts and helping hands, proving that even in the worst of times, the best of humanity can emerge. In the end, Maya realized the story of Riverside Valley wasn't really about natural disasters at all. It was about the disaster that strikes every community when people become isolated from each other, and the miracle that happens when they choose to reconnect. The earthquake and flood had simply provided the catalyst for a transformation that was always possible. The transformation that occurs when people remember that kindness isn't just something we give to others, but something we give to ourselves and to the world we all share.